with Liberal Senator James Paterson. Thanks for joining us, James. Look, first up, I want to get you on this SportsLords affair. The opposition in the question time in the House today focused very heavily on the Prime Minister there. Is it the case that there were grants approved here minutes after the election was called in the official caretaker period? And is the Prime Minister in strife through his role or the role of his office?
Chris, I will caution you not to take everything said by the Labor Party in question time today at face value and to independently judge for yourself, and there'll be plenty of time and opportunity to do that.
Don't worry, Senator. Don't worry, Senator. I will make my own judgments, but I'm asking you a question. Is it the case that the grants here were officially approved after 17 minutes after the election was called?
Well, Chris, the honest answer is I have no idea. I have no visibility of that. That's certainly an allegation that has been raised. All I'm doing is exercising general caution here about accepting these things at face value. As I mentioned, there's a Senate inquiry going on right now into that, and no doubt that will make a report in due course. It is a majority Labor and crossbench and Greens committee, so no doubt that'll be critical, but I'll be paying very close attention to any minority report or dissenting report issued by the Liberal and National senators on that committee, Matt Canavan and Erica Betts.
Yeah, there's lots to get on with. Let me ask you about my opening argument there that the government hasn't got a big enough economic reform agenda, that we're facing all sorts of economic challenges this year. Isn't it time that Scott Morrison, Josh Frydenberg, all of you as a government really seized the agenda and came up with some plans to inject some growth into this economy, to reform it for the future?
Well, there's two things I'd say to that, Chris. Firstly, I think you're being a little bit unfair. Right now, underway is the largest personal income tax cuts since the Howard Costello era.
Is it worth thinking about bringing them forward? Is it worth thinking about bringing those cuts or some of them forward in order to stimulate the economy?
You'd be hard-pressed to find me ever arguing against tax cuts of any kind at any time, Chris. However, I would say, consistent with returning the budget to surplus as soon as we can and as sustainably as we can, obviously we are facing pretty significant pressures on the budget at the moment with the ongoing drought, with the bushfires and now with the coronavirus, and all of those events will combine to probably reduce government revenue and increase government expenditure, and that obviously makes it more difficult to deliver a surplus, and it makes it more difficult to do things like bringing forward those tax cuts. But the good news is they're already legislated, and it's in fact abolishing an entire rate of tax, which means the vast majority of working age Australians will just pay a maximum rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. I think that's great reform. But I was alluding to that, my second response to your question, which is, of course, governments always need to be thinking about the future and always need to be thinking about reform to support economic growth and to support the efficiency and the productivity of the economy. And I have no doubt that while the government is very much focused at the moment on dealing with the crises that we have, that in time there will be more on that front as well.
All right, I want to move to China. You've been an outspoken critic of the Chinese communist regime, so much so that they rescinded an invitation for you to go to China. On the program last night, I spoke to Daniel and Cindy, two Chinese Australians living and working in Sydney. They're involved in the Falun Gong movement, but they talked about how openly the Chinese embassy and consulate here pressure them commercially and over their organisation to try and dissuade people from having anything to do with them in this country. Just have a look, a little bit of what Cindy had to say.
Chinese embassy still keep giving interference. For example, this year they make the phone call to the theatre and trying to give them the pressure. And in Perth, the theatre declined the application for Shen Yun to be hosted.
Yes, Cindy recounting how the Shen Yun Theatre finds it difficult to book a theatre to put on its displays because the Chinese embassy puts pressure on them. Do you believe that this sort of intimidation is commonplace in Australia, and how can Australia actually push back against it?
I know that it is, and it's even clearer this week than it was last week, because the Director General of ASIO gave a speech this week where he recounted a series of anecdotes. He didn't name any particular countries, but a series of anecdotes where he said that Australian citizens had been intimidated by foreign intelligence officers, and diaspora communities had been intimidated by foreign intelligence operators. That particular case of the theatre booking in Perth is a really concerning one. I mean, do we really think it's appropriate or okay for the Chinese Communist Party to be deciding which arts groups can book out a theatre in Australia? It is absurd and enormous overreach.
I just want to move on to the coronavirus issue, because the Prime Minister late today with the Health Minister, as you've seen here on Sky News, announced that the country is moving into pandemic preparations, even though the World Health Organisation has not declared a pandemic yet. Does this mean that we are resigned to the virus actually getting into these shores and infecting people onshore in this country?
It means, Chris, that we're taking every step that we can to be as prepared as possible if that does eventuate. And a lot of the independent expert commentary that has been happening over the last few days is predicting that we'll head in that direction. And so the responsible thing for any government to do in that situation is to prepare for it and to alert the public to that possibility, which I think was part of the purpose of the Prime Minister's press conference.
Yeah, for hospitals and others to prepare. Also, the travel ban from mainland China into Australia has been extended another week. This is bad news for our education sector. There are Chinese students who want to get to Australia to study here who are saying they'd be happy to go into quarantine on Christmas Island if the Australian government could fly them out. Is that a length we ought to be considering going to protect the education system and to support those students?
I thought the decision that the National Security Committee of Cabinet made today to extend the travel ban was a very appropriate one, and an appropriately cautious one that relied on the medical evidence. Although I'm very sympathetic to the students who'd like to return to Australia, there are approximately 100,000 international students from China who are studying in Australia who are not yet here in Australia, and it is simply impractical to think that the Australian government could quarantine them on Christmas Island or anywhere else for that matter. The people who've been quarantined in Christmas Island and in Darwin, who are Australian citizens or permanent residents and their family members, have been in far, far smaller numbers than that. That would be an enormously complex logistical exercise, and I think, in my view, too far.
Yeah, it's a pretty difficult one. Thanks so much for joining us, Senator.
Thank you, Chris.